In this video, we discuss why the 2023 cost of living adjustment may not represent reality for many retirees. Coming up next on Holy Schmidt.
Holy Schmidt!
I was in Columbus, Ohio a few months ago, and I was approached by an older gentleman who watches the channel. He was very nice. I ran into him in the lobby of the hotel that I was staying at, and we struck up a conversation about the cost of living adjustment, Social Security, and inflation. His concern was that in the past, the cost of living adjustment didn't reflect his personal situation in life. He retired several years ago and noted that the last two COLA adjustments didn't reflect inflation, at least not his inflation. And in fact, inflation seemed to get worse post the adjustment. I explained that the COLA adjustment represented the previous year's inflation and was not a number anticipating the current year, but it would eventually catch up. But then he said something that got me thinking about what happens to so many retirees and was the genesis for this video. He seemed to indicate that his costs went up even higher than the COLA adjustment in many areas, while in others they seem to be okay. It doesn't take a lot of work to know that your dollar today doesn't buy what it bought a year ago. As of July 2022, the inflation index called the Consumer Price Index showed an annualized inflation number of 8.5%. But when you deconstruct that number, many costs were up more than 8.5%, some of them as high as 70 or 80% higher year over year. And for those of you who don't know, the inflation index, CPI, is what determines your cost of living adjustment every single year. But here's the question. If at the end of 2022, the inflation index showed an 8.5% increase and retirees received an 8.5% increase in their cost of living adjustment, would that increase be enough to cover their increase in costs? Many people would say no, and for a portion of them, they might be right. Let me explain. There are two reasons why the inflation index won't capture what the average retiree, or many retirees anyway, will spend in the year ahead. The first is that the categories for the inflation index are weighted towards the entire population, not just for retirees. Yet retirees spend differently than the population at large. The inflation index top 5 categories are transportation, which is coming in at 16.9% of the total spend, and it represents things like fuel, automobile costs, maintenance, insurance, etc. Food, which represents 15.4% of total spending. Medical costs, which represent 6.1% of total spending, and education, which represents 5.9% of total spending. For reference, here's a side-by-side comparison of how someone 65 years and older spends their funds. Housing represents 35% of total household spending. Transportation represents 15%. Healthcare represents 14%. Food, 16.2%. And utilities is number 5 at 8%. You can already start to see a problem. Housing costs, for example, are lower for a retiree, and retirees often own their own home, either outright, which means that their housing costs represent taxes, or with a fixed mortgage payment. So their costs don't generally go up too much. Taxes can certainly go up, of course, but they won't represent 35% of a retiree's total cash flow on household spending. Now, what happens if the housing inflation number is lower than the overall average? Well, it pulls the average down, and that is exactly what's happening. When this happens, the funds that a retiree has dedicated to spending goes towards the other items in the top 5, and candidly, most of those actually are well in excess of 8.5%. By the way, as of July 2022, housing was running at an annualized inflation rate of 5.7%. Transportation was particularly hard hit, even though gasoline is down from its peaks. At July 2022, it was still up 44% over the same period of time last year. The good news, by the way, is that all things being equal, summer tends to have higher fuel prices than the rest of the year, and we're through the summer, at least for 2022. In terms of healthcare, medical services were up 5.1% in terms of the overall inflation index, but the cost of Medicare Part D was up 14%, so there was a pretty big increase on that 5.1% number. This increase in Medicare Part B is because while the costs themselves didn't go up dramatically, the individual claims, the number of claims went up dramatically because of COVID, and also something called Aduhelm, which is an Alzheimer's medicine that came online last year. The 5th item on the overall list is education, not a big item for retirees, but number 5 on the retiree list is utilities, and frankly, that number actually got hammered for a retiree. Electricity was up 15.7% year over year. Natural gas was up 30.5% year over year. Fuel oil was up 75.6% year over year, a big increase. The next part is the inflation adjustment itself. It's based on spending habits, not a constant basket of items that don't change. And people tend to spend less when inflation is running high than they do during the good times, or they spend differently anyway. Here's what I mean. The inflation index, in one form or another, has been around since 1919. In the beginning, there was no need to worry about what was in the basket because it didn't change. Products and services were put into the basket, and a year or two later, the companies and the products and services were still available in the open market. In 1919, for example, the basket might include Red Circle coffee, Armour bacon, and Artos soft drinks. Now, if you don't know what any of those are, you're not alone. None of them exist today. By the way, fish and chicken were considered a poor person's beef, not a healthy and expensive alternative as they are today in 2022. The same could be said with items in the healthcare segment of the basket. For example, Chamberlain's colic and cholera remedy was very expensive. Its active ingredient was a highly addictive drug that is not available today, but it certainly was available over the counter back then. By the way, the replacement to this type of medicine is Tums. If you used to buy 93 octane for your Firebird Trans Am, today you might buy 91 octane, and if nobody's looking, maybe even 89 octane. If people do this in mass because they want to save money or because a product is no longer available, then the basket changes. The categories stay, but the items in the categories do not. This has a tendency to drive inflation numbers down. Even if you're buying 93 octane gas for your Trans Am, others are buying 91. And so 91 is the new benchmark. Think about this across all products and categories. Filet mignon is $14 a pound. New York strip is $10 a pound. A BMW 5 Series is $54,000. An Acura TLX is $39,000. You get the point. If the world substitutes, which happens in highly inflationary times like right now, the basket composition changes and true inflation is not reflected. The good news is that we have the ability to bring our costs down through substitution. Not all countries have this option. By making different choices, that fact alone will help us navigate these inflationary times. Add to that forward thinking and planning, and you should be able to navigate these rocky times until we come out on the other end. In my next video, I discuss tips and tricks to help keep inflation under control. This is Jeff Schmidt. Thanks for watching.